Chevy racers could argue with Ford guys about engines all day long. Small block versus Windsor, Camaro versus Mustang, Bowtie versus Blue Oval. But once the horsepower climbed and the slicks started hooking, something strange kept showing up underneath some of America's fastest Chevrolets. The engine was Chevy. The transmission might be Chevy. The body definitely was Chevy. But the rear end? Ford. And here's the part that makes no sense at first. Chevrolet's own 12-bolt was lighter and could actually waste less horsepower than the famous Ford 9-inch. Yet racers kept replacing it anyway. So whatever Ford had done right had to be worth giving up efficiency, adding weight, and swallowing a little brand pride. The answer wasn't one magic feature. It was a combination so effective that Ford's rear end eventually became bigger than Ford itself. This is Motor Memento, where America's automotive past comes back to life. Subscribe, and let's find out why Chevy racers kept trusting Ford underneath their cars. Ford versus Chevrolet isn't just a preference in American performance culture. For a lot of racers, it's closer to an identity. Mustang versus Camaro, small block versus small block, Blue Oval versus Bowtie. Which is exactly why finding Ford hardware bolted underneath a serious Chevrolet feels like such a contradiction. This wasn't one eccentric builder doing something odd in his garage. Ford 9-inch rear ends became common across race cars from multiple brands, including plenty of Chevrolets. Not every Chevy racer made the swap, but it happened often enough to become a racing favorite in its own right. So here's the real question. What did Ford build back in 1957 that eventually made racers set aside one of America's fiercest rivalries? To understand that, you first have to understand what a rear end has to survive. Power in a rear-wheel drive car travels a long chain before it reaches the pavement. Engine to transmission, transmission to driveshaft to differential, and finally, out through the axle shafts. The rear end sits at the very end of that chain, absorbing whatever gets sent its way. On a normal street car, that load builds gradually. At the drag strip, everything changes instantly. The engine is already making serious torque. First gear multiplies it. The rear end ratio multiplies it again. Then sticky slicks refuse to just spin away the stress, and that force slams straight through the drivetrain. Here's what surprises people. The better a racer got at making the tires hook, the harder they were on everything behind the transmission. That punishment is exactly what pushed Ford's design into the spotlight. The pinion is the smaller gear that receives power from the driveshaft and drives the big ring gear. Under extreme torque, that pinion wants to deflect, to move away from where it's supposed to mesh. Ford's 9-inch added extra support close to the head of the pinion, giving it unusually strong resistance to that movement compared to a lot of competing designs. The harder the drivetrain tried to force those gears apart, the better Ford's design kept them exactly where they belonged. That helped the gear set survive brutal launches. But strength alone doesn't explain why Chevy racers accepted the 9-inch's disadvantages. For that, you have to look at a trade-off Ford made on purpose. The Ford 9-inch uses a relatively large hypoid offset, meaning the pinion sits farther below the ring gear's centerline than a design like the GM 12-bolt. That geometry creates more contact between the gear teeth, and more contact means more strength. But nothing comes free. More sliding contact means more friction, more heat, and a bit more parasitic loss. Comparisons commonly place that difference in the low single-digit percentage range. The honest version is this. The Ford rear end could absorb slightly more engine power than a Chevy 12-bolt before it ever reached the tires. So why give up horsepower on purpose? Because the fastest car in the pits means nothing if the rear end lets go before the finish line. Strength kept the gears alive. The next feature saved something just as valuable at the racetrack: time. This might be the biggest reason the 9-inch became a legend. Instead of hiding the ring gear, pinion, and differential inside the axle housing, Ford packaged all of it into a removable third member, sometimes called the center section or the pumpkin. Picture a racer standing in the pits with the clock running. Instead of tearing into the housing for a new gear ratio, they could simply have a second or third center section already built and ready to drop in. One track favors a steep ratio, another needs something else. Swap the third member, and you're back on the line. Ford wasn't only handing racers a strong rear end, it was handing them a modular one, long before anyone could tune a car through a laptop. That removable third member turned hours of teardown into a swap finished before the next round. Have you ever had to make a last-minute gear change before a race, or watched someone scramble to? Let us know in the comments. And Ford had another advantage waiting at the outer ends of the axle. A lot of GM rear ends, including the 12-bolt, use small clips inside the differential, known as C-clips, to hold the axle shafts in place. The Ford 9-inch typically uses bearings and external retaining plates out at the ends of the housing instead. Why does that matter? Because if certain C-clip configurations suffer an axle failure, that shaft can potentially slide outward, since the part holding it in place sits inside the differential. That's exactly why serious racers running GM rear ends often add C-clip eliminators before hitting the track. Ford's design simply started closer to what racing demanded. Before this turns into another Ford beats Chevy story, let's be honest. The GM 12-bolt was never junk. It became one of the most respected performance rear ends America ever produced. It's lighter, it loses less power to friction, and it can handle serious horsepower when it's built right. Chevrolet racers who stuck with it had every reason to. If this is the kind of old-school engineering rivalry you enjoy, subscribe to Motor Memento, because Ford's biggest advantage still wasn't inside the gears. The real comparison was never about surviving one good launch. It was about which rear end stayed easy to adapt once racers kept pushing past what either company designed it for. Ford built the 9-inch into an enormous range of cars and trucks for decades, so racers could find housings, center sections, gears, and axles almost anywhere. Once a part becomes that common, more people learn to work on it, more companies manufacture pieces for it, more ratios become available. The 9-inch became popular because it was useful, then even more useful because it was popular. Eventually, the aftermarket took it over completely. Companies began producing stronger housings, aftermarket center sections, big spline axle shafts, spools, locking differentials, and complete bolt-in rear ends. A racer today can build a full 9-inch rear assembly without a single piece that ever touched a Ford factory floor. At that point, calling it a Ford rear end starts to feel almost misleading. Ford drew the blueprint. American racing built its own ecosystem on top of it. If pure strength were the whole story, the Dana 60 should have won outright. It carries an even bigger ring gear and enormous strength. So why didn't it become the universal choice? Because racers were never chasing one number. They needed strength, weight, serviceability, parts support, and efficiency, all working together. The Dana can be heavier, the 12-bolt more efficient, and the Ford 9-inch landed in an unusually attractive middle ground between them. A racer might love Chevrolet engines and Chevrolet styling right down to the paint code. But once real money and real competition enter the picture, priorities shift. What survives a hard launch? What can be repaired between rounds? What gets the team back for the next race? That's how Ford 9-inch rear ends kept finding their way underneath Camaros, Novas, and Chevelles that never wore a blue oval anywhere else on them. Performance eventually mattered more than the badge stamped on the part. Chevy racers could live with Ford winning one argument, as long as the part was hidden underneath the car. Ford stopped building the 9-inch decades ago, and yet this hardware is still manufactured, developed, sold, and raced today. It outlived the cars it originally came in, outlived its own production era, and even outlived Ford's own manufacturing of the part. Its architecture simply became racing infrastructure. Chevy racers weren't admitting Ford built a better car. They were admitting Ford had designed one component too useful to ignore. The Ford 9-inch never became famous because it was perfect. The Chevy 12-bolt was lighter and more efficient, and the Dana 60 could be even stronger. But Ford combined strength, easy servicing, interchangeable gearing, secure axle retention, and decades of parts support into one package. Racers could keep adapting for as long as they needed it. Eventually, the badge stopped mattering. A Chevy could stay Chevrolet everywhere the crowd could see, while one of Ford's greatest engineering victories sat hidden underneath it. So tell us in the comments, have you ever run a Ford 9-inch under a non-Ford car, or is brand loyalty a line you'd never cross, no matter how strong the part is? If you enjoy the forgotten decisions that shaped American performance, subscribe to Motor Memento, because sometimes the most important part of a legendary car is the one nobody ever notices.